Welcome back to Baithak. This is Ari Mokhtan and this is my podcast. Today, under Khabar, we'll be discussing the recent Teesta floodings, and we'll also be continuing our discussion into the effect of hip hop on the Gorkha identity. For Khabar today, we will be discussing the Teesta River flooding that has been going on in the Teesta River Valley. Now, this has been caused by incessant rainfall in the Mangan area in Sikkim, which caused the Teesta River to overflow, causing massive flash floods all across the Teesta River. A lot of property was destroyed due to this, and it's estimated that almost 6 people are dead and almost 1,500 people are stranded. Let's look at a short clip of these occurrences. Now, the National Disaster Response Force was deployed to better mitigate this situation and to create a relief situation for these people. Along with the police and the local army, they've been helping all the people who have been affected. But let us go a bit into depth of the background of the situation and to really understand what exactly causes these flash floods. Now, we may have noticed that this situation has been a repeated situation in the past few years. So let's go into a depth of what exactly is causing this situation. Now, there was a beautiful research done by the hydrology research team, for which I will be linking down below for the entire study, which you can go through. But it basically talks about how the areas in which these flash floods have been taking place create a very unique set of circumstances which is very prone to flash floods. First of all, it does talk about the effects of global warming, and it basically talks about how the different glaciers melting have caused a rise in the volume of the Teesta rivers as they are fed by the Himalayan glaciers melting. Also, now Teesta is a very unique situation that it does not only depend on the glaciers melting to feed into its data, it also depends on a lot of other tributaries flowing into Teesta. Now, this has also created a unique set of circumstances because each of these tributaries are also affected by glaciers melting and them increasing volume. So that only couples exponentially to create a higher volume for Teesta. On top of that, Teesta is what is known as a braided river. Now, what exactly is a braided river means that the underlying river bed upon which the Teesta river flows is very highly undulating, and it creates these unique water flows and these rocks and these higher lands and lower lands which cause the river to flow in a very braided nature. So basically it's like the braids of a hair where individual strands flow across each other. So the Teesta works and flows more like a lot of rivers flowing together. Now, couple this with the increase in these freaky natural phenomena which have been going on in Sikkim and a lot of the Himalayan region of cloudbursts. Now, cloudbursts are just massive amounts of rainfall in very short periods of time. So this highly volumizes the Teesta river, and since it is a braided river, each of these flows of or the braids of the Teesta river overflow and create this unique situation for flash floods to take place. Now, it's very difficult. This research paper does go into the details of how it's very difficult to predict these types of situations. So it's very difficult to even prepare for these types of situations. Now, there is a sort of a remedy which could be applied, that you could particularly essentially put sensors in various places. You could increase the technology by which you are essentially measuring and predicting the weather in these areas, but that can only go so far. So the best way to mitigate these situations and the best way to essentially create relief for these areas is to have a very steady and Rockford plan. Now, in the relief for the recent activities that have been happening, we have seen a marked problem in the infrastructural shortcomings of the areas. Now, first and foremost, the roads which are constructed along these rivers and which essentially connect the main cities to these minute villages are very bad in nature, and this is very evident by the fact that these flash floods have completely destroyed some of these roads, and it becomes very difficult for the relief teams and the relief supply to reach these areas. So if we could have better infrastructure in that, it would really help the relief process. Coupled with that, that there's very bad infrastructure for storage of relief funds and relief equipment which is sent in. So that also creates a lot of problems. So if we could essentially create a better infrastructural layout for relief and also have a steadfast plan in which, like, if certain area is affected by flash floods, this is what we're going to do, this is the protocol, this is how we're going to tackle the situation, then that would really help out. And if we could create a efficient evacuation system by which we could just relocate these people to a new place, or just relocate them to a place temporarily for when they get hit by these flash floods, that would really help the process of relief as well. Now, I think it was beautifully said by Mr. Raju Bishta, Member of Parliament of the Darjeeling Hills, that the local, the state, the panchayat and the Darjeeling governments have to work in harmony. There can be no place for blame gaming and pushing around the buck. Everybody needs to take responsibility. Everybody needs to work together to tackle these types of situations. Now let us continue our discussion that we were having over the overarching story of the Gorkha identity, of the Indian Gorkha identity. Last week we talked about how liberalism has affected, how it has entrenched itself into the Gorkha identity and how influential it has become. Today I would like to talk about another facet which I feel is as equally as important and maybe even more influential in affecting the youth of the Indian Gorkha communities, and that is hip-hop. Hip-hop essentially started as a movement by the African American people to basically, I know this may come as a shock, to basically promote ideologies of anti-violence and anti-drug use. Now, hip-hop essentially has this thing about it. It has this thing of giving a voice to the voiceless ideas, a voice to elements of society which have been subdued. And I feel the black community has been very successful in using hip-hop to basically showcase the situations that they've been going through, the harsh economic conditions that they were going through, the racism that they were facing, and also to a certain extent the police brutality that they were facing. If you look at old school hip-hop, then you will see that most of the things that they are talking about are the issues that the community is facing, and due to this they were able to raise a lot of awareness to the situations that their communities were facing and bring a lot of limelight into that so that work could be done upon this. Now, over the years, hip-hop has moved away from that, and it has actually become the very thing that it was trying to destroy, by which today you can see that hip-hop is very pro-drug use, and it's become a means to promote drugs. It's also become essentially a forum by which you can flex, and by which you can flex the money that you have, or the various ideas. It's also promoting a lot of violence and gang warfare and stuff like that, and it's also creating this toxic culture among the youth, especially with sex and especially with drugs and especially with the flexing nature of things. It's creating a lot of materialism as well. Now, basically there is 4 segmentations of hip-hop, as you can call it. There's DJing, there's rapping, there's b-boying, and then there's graffiti. Now, when you look at it from the Indian Gorkha perspective, all 4 of this have been clearly imbibed by the society. And I think it comes on the heels of how the society of the Indian Gorkhas have been able to identify a lot with rebellious music and rebellious genres of music. Our youth and our generation really identified with hip-hop, but if you look at the previous generations, they really identified with rock music, and they also really identified with metal music. Now, both these genres, all 3 of these genres have something in similar, that essentially they are rebellious music, they are anarchist music. They are basically fighting against something and fighting against an ideology, which I feel our community can really relate to, because we essentially as a community have always been fighting against a higher power, and I feel that really resonates with us. That's why we've been very big fans of these types of music. Now, especially hip hop, when you look at it, it basically talks about the struggles of a particular community and how through their music they've been able to express their values. Now, I feel that if implied in this method, it can be very beneficial to the society of the Indian Gorkhas. But I feel that in reality, it has been having the opposite effect. I personally think that hip hop is the major reason for the massive increase of drug use among the youth of the hills and the youth of the Indian Gorkha communities. Because what the drug promotion nature and the flex culture nature of hip hop has done is created drugs to be what is known as a socially enriching item, or essentially it has made drug use cool. And it's become very cool to use drugs due to hip hop, because hip hop promotes drug use and it talks about drugs as if it's a very wonderful, and it's basically causing the youth of the Indian Gorkhas to think that if you use drugs, then you essentially enter a higher tier of the society, and that creates avenues, that creates better opportunities, but that's of course all a lie. Now we will delve more deeper into this, into our discussions in drug use in the hills, but I sincerely blame hip hop for creating these avenues and creating this culture among the Indian Gorkha societies. Now, if you really want to implicate hip hop essentially to its roots and utilize it in that manner, then I feel it can be very beneficial to our society. To this credit, I would like to point out that there are a lot of artists, such as I personally want to give a shout out to my brother Bantawa, who has been very prolific and very successful in his music that he creates, that it essentially portrays the Indian Gorkha identity. And I'm sure all of you would agree that In the Hills by him and Halka was one of the most resonating music, and it really feels proud that it came from somewhere that we identify with, and it really put out our society for everyone else to see. So if you could create that, if you could use hip hop to essentially portray your society and portray the issues, because that is what essentially the blacks did, and that's why hip hop was so successful. So if you could go back to those roots, utilize hip hop in a very progressive way, and of course, not every song is going to need to be about culture, not every song is going to need to be about, boring issues like these, but essentially, hip hop has this beauty to it that it can make these boring issues into interesting topics. It can shed light into these topics and bring it into pop culture and bring it into discussion. And that is the most powerful thing about hip hop. So if we could harness that, then nothing else could be more beneficial to our society. But at the very moment, at the very base reality, it has become a very detrimental thing for the Indian Gorkha society. And that is something I feel demands discussion and demands explanation and also demands reform. The first comment we have is by Vikasha, who basically states about the feminism discussions that we were having on the last episode. Now, I went ahead and said that feminism is essentially destroying the choice, and that I made the argument that a lot of women want to be wives and want to be house bearers and want to be mothers. But she goes against that, and she calls that essentially a brainwash idea of the patriarchy. Now, she also goes on to say that no woman should be dependent on her husband, and every woman should have that financial independence. And I feel I essentially strongly disagree with that, because it used to work, Now, I'm not supporting the patriarchy and I'm not trying to argue or promote it, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that it's a very stable structure when the male brings in the resources for the family and the woman nurtures it and creates it. That's why there is the saying that a man creates a house, but a woman creates a home. Now, I'm not saying that a man cannot create a home or that only women and women cannot work or something of that nature, but it's a very stable system. And the psychology of men and women does argue for this. Men have a natural inclination to slog, men have a natural inclination to work, and they can really delve themselves into work and find pleasure in that. Now, I don't necessarily believe that women have that same inclination. Now, of course, a woman can be successful in her career, but as long as until she's not nurturing a family member, she's not nurturing individual humans, I don't think she can find the satisfaction in life, and I don't think they can find that purpose in life, because essentially, as Jordan Peterson says, men are more focused on things and women are more focused on people. That's the reason why men tend to take more jobs towards the STEM fields, which focus more on things, and women tend to take jobs such as nursing and such as other jobs which primarily focus on people. That's why I feel that women are much more successful in the hoteling industry, because that industry essentially deals with people and women have a better inclination in doing that. So I essentially disagree with that, but of course, to each their own. She also goes on to state that the idea of divorce and the idea of essentially leaving your abusive husband or leaving your deadbeat husband is a good thing. Now, of course, if a situation gets too toxic and it gets too out of hand, it's always a better thing to leave that. But I feel feminism has also created this nature and this set of circumstances where it's become too easy to break up a marriage. And I don't think having 2 to 3 divorces is any better than what we previously had. So I don't think that's essentially a win for feminism. She also goes on to state that the fascination we have with the Western ideologies and fascination we have with Western culture essentially comes from the English-speaking ISC, ICSE schools that we grew up in and where we study. But of course, there are English-speaking schools in the hills as well as the plains, but there is a marked difference of Western culture influence in the hills. And of course, I think that the schools do play a role, but it goes much more deeper than that, as I previously explained. The second comment we have is by The next comment we have is by Mahesh Bhagtan. He states that, just an observation, not all Gorkhas came to work in the tea garden fields and not all Gorkhas came to work in the armies. Now, I think this is also a fascinating part of our history, which of course I forgot to mention, that Darjeeling has always been inhabited by Lepchas, who were essentially the indigenous people of Darjeeling. And today, the Lepcha community is part of the Indian Gorkha community. So it's, I think, quite wrong to state that the Indian Gorkha community, came from Nepal, because a certain part of the Indian Gorkha community was always in the Darjeeling Hills. And of course, along with that, since we were for a long period of time under Sikkim, a lot of Sikkimese also came into the Indian Gorkha communities. And of course, there was a lot of influx of essentially migrants coming to these areas over the period of time, not just to work. Now, the mass migration happened due to the tea gardens and happened due to the recruitment into the armies, but there have always been Nepali people and Indian Gorkha people living in these areas. So I think that's a very fascinating part of our history, and thank you so much for pointing that out. That's it for the episode today. I thank you all for watching and listening. Godspeed. Until the next episode.